Hey everyone, I'm Ben Norton of Multipolarista, and this is the Empire and the Deep State series that I'm co-hosting with the American Exception podcast and my good friends Aaron Good and Seamus McGuinness. And this is part 7 of the Empire and Deep State series that we're doing. We've covered a lot of ground, although you don't necessarily need to have listened to the past parts to listen to this part. Today we're going to be talking about academia. US academia, Western academia, and the state. So not only the theorization of the state, but also the relationship to the state, to US intelligence agencies, to the national security state. And we're going to begin this episode talking about different theories of the state. And Aaron, we're talking about your book, American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. You're the author, you're a political scientist, a historian. You are very familiar with different academic theories of the state, and you talk in the beginning of this chapter on academia and the state about the concept of the dual state, right? What is the dual state? Explain. And of course, this also is related to the concept we talked about of the tripartite state.
Right. Well, the idea of the state in general is something that has to be addressed in political science because this is the organization. The classic definition from Max Weber is the state is that organization which, in a given territory, maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of force or violence. And this is problematic when the state is understood to be this democratic element where the public is really in control of things, uh, ostensibly, but then you have political forms that emerge that are not like that, that are were not democratic, and the public is not in control, and that the use of violence is maybe further more than what is generally understood, or it goes beyond what is the rule of law and so on, and you have a different kind of state that emerges. And this was first remarked upon by a guy named Ernst Fraenkel, who immigrated to the United States in 1941 from Germany, and he was talking about the German state that had emerged in 1940 by 1941, if you know your history. That is the Nazi state. And he wrote a book, The Dual State: A Contribution to the Study of Dictatorship. And he wrote that the state that had existed before was something that he called the normative state, which was more or less governed constitutionally and run constitutionally, in the way that we understand like a democratic state as functioning. Now, he wrote that there is this prerogative state that emerged, and the prerogative state sort of is like what it sounds. It's like this state that has the prerogative to act decisively, and that its job was to protect the normative state. Okay, so the Nazi version of the state, where the Führer is empowered to like take the necessary steps to protect the state, that is a dualistic kind of a structure where it's like the older institutions still exist, but they're protected by this kind of dark side violent state. Now, in the US, you had Hans Morgenthau, who was a realist, and he immigrated to the United States and then worked with the State Department at some points, but was mostly an international relations scholar, I think at the University of Chicago. And he wrote about this as well. And he wrote that wherever there was I think it was in the 1950s, he writes this, and he's talking about what had happened in the State Department and how McCarthyism had gotten rid of, competent diplomats and replaced them with political hacks in different ways. And that basically it was a dual state that was emerging, like had emerged in every kind of dictatorship, and that it securitizes politics, and that it gives the secret police a veto power over politics. Okay, so this is another idea of the dual state, taking this German model, this Nazi model, and saying, hey, if you empower the national security state, this is the road you're going down, so be careful. Now, fast forward to 2009, you have Ola Tenander, who's a Swedish academic, and he starts to write about this. 2009, then he did some earlier work on it, but there's a 2009 essay in this anthology by Eric Wilson. The anthology is called Government of the Shadows, and it's like, and his essay in it is dealing with the dual state and the democratic state. And he says the democratic state is like open and lawful, run by democratic logics, and the security state is secretive, hierarchical, and has overriding legal immunity. And that's the way that, so Ola Tanander is a radical scholar, and he's starting to write about the security state, the dual state. And for him, he lumps the deep state in together with the dual state. Okay, my main innovation is to call it a tripartite state, where there's a security state that could potentially safeguard democracy, or it could potentially serve oligarchy. And that's what it really ends up doing. The security state gets taken over by oligarchic forces, and that's our tripartite state. But the dual state and this idea of a security state that acts like a dictator, more or less, this is put forward by Frankel, who was the Nazi theorist. Hans Morgenthau writes about this, comes to the US, points out how some things like that are happening. And Ola Tanander in the 21st century writes about it, and Peter Dale Scott adapts it as well. And this is how we finally get some critics that are not in the mainstream talking about the transformation of the state into kind of a dictatorial thing with a democratic facade.
So, Aaron, how has the political science scholarship on the state and the dual state changed over time? Is there, are there more contemporary attempts to try to revise this understanding of the state?
There are, but they're few and far between. I was able to find one person who put forward a very good rendition of the dual state, but taking out the kind of oligarchic elements of it. So he's just really writing. This is kind of what characterizes political science, is that it's written about as though it's apolitical, meaning that you're going to talk about these organizations, but it's not appropriate to write about the sort of top-down economic elite's influence on this. But this guy named Michael Glennon wrote a book called National Security and Double Government. And it's essentially an argument for the dual state, but a very narrow one. He talks about the lawlessness of it, but he doesn't really get into that as a defining feature. And he omits a number of things like that. But he points out that this idea of a double government was kind of a mainstream thing in some ways in Britain back in the 1800s. This guy named Walter Bagehot, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but he wrote about how in the past in Britain, you had these dignified institutions like the Crown and the House of Lords that people understood to be really running things. But over time, you got a second set of efficient institutions like the House of Commons and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, and that power to run the empire had gradually shifted over to these institutions. And so he had what you called a disguised republic, and that this was done to avert a legitimacy crisis, basically, that the British state was transformed in terms of where power really lay, but all the people's loyalty was with the crown and so on. And so it was, these other things exist in a kind of ceremonial way, but really the power is elsewhere. And so this was the beginning of a kind of double government critique. And this was in the pages of The Economist, which is, the magazine that Karl Marx said was a magazine for British millionaires, right? So these people wanted to know and understand the way the world worked. Yeah. Okay, Lenin, very good. Yeah. Okay. So that was the British version of this. But this guy Glennon writes an update of this, and he's a guy, I think he's at Tufts University maybe. And so there's a little bit of scholarship in this realm that's in the mainstream that is at least that's appreciated, because it's a foothold for somebody like me who wanted to do some more radical work.
Right. So that's the theory of the British Empire and the rise of their dual state between the efficient and the dignified institutions. But how does that relate back to the United States, which historically tends to sort of look more anti-imperialist and was able to get away with an anti-colonial narrative because of our own history that maybe didn't look the same as some of the historical European powers did?
Right. Well, the U.S. has had a funny relationship to the idea of imperialism, because they depict themselves as being anti-imperialist, which in a sense they were. The U.S. became a nation state through an anti-colonial war, but they were all obviously guilty of imperialism in a number of ways. I mean, the slaughter of the Indians and the westward expansion, expropriating all the land from American Indians, sea to shining sea. And then the slave trade was an example of imperialism, of course, the Monroe Doctrine and all these other things. But by and large, the U.S. was not exactly the same as the Europeans, who had extraterritorial colonies. And the U.S., for most of its, until the 20th century or the very end of the 1800s, the U.S. did not have that extraterritorial empire, and so it could sort of claim to be anti-imperialist, although we could pick that apart all day. Now, so when the U.S. does become a global power with a lot of international influence, that's in the 20th century, and so Glennon writes about how this double government phenomenon emerges as well in the U.S., pretty much like it did in Britain, as a result of a major of the country becoming the steward of a huge empire, right? And so you have the dignified institutions, like the crown, those that people had some nostalgia for. Those are called the Madisonian institutions for the U.S. under Glennon's framework. And these would be those institutions laid out in the Constitution: Congress, the judiciary, and the presidency. And the national security aspect of it, or the part that really runs things, the efficient part that runs the empire, he calls these a Trumanite network, because it was the foundation for it was established with the National Security Act of 1947. And it's a network because there's so many organizations involved in this that for the person looking at national security decisions, it's very difficult to see where decisions actually get made and who makes them. And this is, of course, very useful for people really running things, because if everybody is responsible, really nobody is responsible. So this is part of how you have this foreign policy that never changes, because no matter what disaster you have, nobody's really held accountable for it. So even when nominally we know, like, for example, President Bush was responsible for the Iraq War, and he said, like, I'm the decider, right? Well, it doesn't matter, because there's an immunity to any sort of consequences, it seems, for these things, unless there's an immunity until there's not, as Trump, found out getting impeached twice, or as Nixon found out, or John Kennedy found out. So, but the state itself is, even then, it operates in strange ways. If you're gonna take on these forces, even as the president, the resistance manifests itself in strange ways. Maybe assassination, maybe weird impeachment spectacles, all these sort of things. So, as with other people in the past, Glennon says that the U.S. was kind of unintentionally doing this. Okay, and this is probably a shortcoming of Glennon's work, that it was he almost says it was a fit of absence of mind, but he doesn't quite go that far. He ignores the ways that the national security state emerged from elite machinations, that they constructed it on purpose. But at least he's useful in saying, okay, the U.S. does have this kind of dualism of the state, and that the democratic state does not have much control over foreign policy and U.S. imperialism. So this is a step forward, at least in terms of acknowledging that aspect of it.
Right, and we'll come back to some of your broader critique of Glennon's theory and where it falls short. But I think using the term Madisonian and Trumanite sort of betrays these two historical epochs, and the idea that in some way Truman was sort of the rise of this institutionalized power elite. But that's sort of implying in a way that then were there efficient institutions in America before 1947? Because some people could argue that even going back to Adam Smith, he said that, civil government, so far as it's instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor. And Michael Parenti calls that the gangster state. Madison and Jefferson themselves were pretty openly anti-democracy, because they understood that the American government was constituted to protect the rich. So is this more of the Trumanite network? Is it an extension out of it? Is it a global network as opposed to maybe a domestic network for elite control? Or what sets apart this Madisonian institutions from the Trumanite network in terms of looking at things like the rise of the Council on Foreign Relations or the Fed, and some things that actually came out of the British Empire right at the turn of the century, as they sort of built this nexus of London and Wall Street financial power. That is sort of a cradle or a birthplace for this, that evolves into this institutionalized form. But what really sets it apart, and is there a dividing line there with Truman that is Glennon founded in laying down that dividing line?
Yeah, this gets into some of the historical aspects of it, but I think that they're worth looking at. It's not a complete 180 that the US does when it enters into World War II. The history of the early part of the 20th century and the late 1800s are the US empire expanding with the Spanish American War, the annexation of Hawaii, US participation in the Boxer Rebellion and the Open Door. And that leads up to US entry into World War I, which was really an imperialist war and a war that the US enters into for not so much not altruistic reasons, but really, greed. I mean, I think you have to say it. They made enormous amounts of money on the war. It created it helped corporate interests a whole lot. And in 1917, when the Russians are defeated, potentially looks like you're going to get either a German victory or a stalemate. And probably the only reason that the Allies prevail is because of the U.S. be the most powerful country in the world in terms of industrial capacity and resources, that they enter in on the side of the Allies. And the U.S. had been neutral. The public didn't really want this war, but they enter because of massive mobilization propaganda campaign. These same forces that would propel the U.S. to go for empire during World War II, they make that decision. And so there was the forces that led to the creation of the Trumanite Network were rising in power all throughout the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s of the 20th century. So this is something worth keeping in mind for understanding the sort of genealogy of the American empire, that these massive concentrations of capital, of wealth, especially Morgan and Rockefeller, they looked overseas for resources and markets. And they did have a relationship with the British elites, like the Round Table groups set up by Milner and Cecil Rhodes. The sister version of it in New York was the Council on Foreign Relations, established with Wall Street and Rockefeller money. These are the people that planned the United States entry into World War II. And these are the people that put Truman in power anyway. I mean, Truman, it's funny that he would focus on Truman when Truman's main attractive quality to the American oligarchy that basically parachuted him into the vice presidency to take over for FDR, his main quality was that he was just co-optable, that he was a guy who served people in power and that he didn't have any basis for being an independent statesman. He wasn't especially brilliant or well-versed in understanding the elites in the American, social system. He was a guy that was just could be manipulated. And so he creates all of these networks. So there's a lot of intentionality on the part of the elites, but it's carried out through a vessel like Truman. And so I think that that's the way you want to look at the rise of the American version and how it does connect to extant forces in American society that we're looking for imperial expansion and lots of money to be made anywhere in the world.
Yeah, one of the more interesting parts of this chapter, Aaron, is you recount what was revealed by Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower, in his memoir, The Doomsday Machine, which was recently published. I mean, I read this book and it blew my mind. I mean, some of the information that he revealed in this. And you talk about one of the most chilling revelations, which is the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan, the JSCP. You can talk about what that is, but this essentially revealed that the U.S. military was operating essentially separately from the public state, from the political class, and had these plans for nuclear war on the Soviet Union and China, and stated very clearly that, quote, the basic military objective of the U.S. armed forces is the defeat of the Sino-Soviet bloc, which is actually pretty ironic because we know about the Sino-Soviet split. The Soviet Union and China ended up falling out and having a lot of differences between them, largely, not entirely, but partially because of U.S. attempts to divide them. But anyway, the point is that Ellsberg revealed in his book that the U.S. military had made plans that if there was a war that broke out, by simply the way the technology was set up, it could not be changed. The policy could not be changed. The U.S. were to launch nuclear weapons, would launch nuclear weapons on both the Soviet Union and China, destroying both. And we now know, as you mentioned in your book, that would lead to nuclear winter and the potential death of humanity. But anyway, the point is, I kind of stole the thunder there a little bit, but I just wanted to emphasize how extreme those revelations were in that book by Ellsberg, The Doomsday Machine. And in my view, it got tragically little coverage. So anyway, talk about the role of Ellsberg in this and what the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan says about the state, the dual state, and military autonomy in the U.S.
Well, this is a good example in terms of illustrating the degree to which these unelected agencies in the government can determine policy, and not just in areas that are insignificant or where the politicians don't have the time to really get in there in the weeds and deal with the specifics of it. This is a case of where there's no more important issue than this. This is it had within it the potential to end life on end all of humanity. I mean, more or less to end human civilization. Anything more than a skirmish between U.S. and Soviet forces would lead to the launching of the General War Plan, and the General War Plan was to nuke all, because with these ballistic missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the logic is use them or lose them. So if there's a war, you better use them because they're sitting targets otherwise. So you got to launch them all at once. Can't be just sitting there with them in your pocket. You gotta launch them. And then they thought, well, they're out. The Soviets and the Chinese are allies, so we can't really just bomb all of the Soviet Union, which is staggering to think of it by itself. We got to also take out China. And then the punchline to that is that would also lead to nuclear winter and kill all of human civilization. They didn't know this at the time, but even just what was known about the plan that Ellsberg was looking at and the numbers that it would kill immediately, just as a matter of course, this was very alarming to him. And what makes this even more disturbing is that it was a policy in the Pentagon that if you were the initials themselves, JSCP, was not to ever be used in any communication between the Pentagon and other departments of the government. Okay, so no one could even know that this existed, which would be one thing. That's disturbing enough, but it wasn't even, the president wasn't supposed to know about it. Okay, that should be very alarming. Even crazier than that, the Secretary of Defense was not to know about this. So if they were writing about this, they would have to edit in a document that was going to the Secretary of Defense, the civilian in charge of the Pentagon, right besides the president, that they would have to retype the document because they didn't have word processors back then. They'd have to retype the document and remove reference to the JSCP, because otherwise the defense secretary might ask, what is the JSCP? And they would say, oh, well, it's our sort of automatic response to nuke all of Russia and China. And then they might say that they don't like that. And then they would have to change the policy. And the Joint Chiefs apparently really like this policy because they didn't want it to even come up for review. So Ellsberg sees this and is very alarmed and decides to go around the heads of his supervisors, risk getting fired because he thought this was so disturbing. And he eventually gets it to McGeorge Bundy, who gets it to President Kennedy, and President Kennedy changes the policy. And he actually has Ellsberg draft the policy. So Ellsberg comes up with this new policy, and he finishes it, I think, on the day before the first draft of it. He finishes the day before his 30th birthday. So if you're feeling like you haven't accomplished as much in your life, that might make you feel worse that that's what he was doing before he even turned 30. And this shows us a couple of things. One, it gives us some insight into Ellsberg and how he was a guy, a rare person in these circles, in that he didn't just blindly respect the chain of command, even if it was going to march humanity off a cliff, and so you can understand more of what he did during the Pentagon Papers. But also, it shows us the power of these institutions to act in a dictatorial sense, in the worst way of thinking about it, because this could have ended all of humanity, and this is a supposedly democratic state, but there was no oversight from any elected officials on this, except for the fact that one person was insubordinate and brought this information to the right people. So this could, and America's only gone further to the right in many ways. I do think that perhaps the generals are less crazy on the nuclear side of things, although that could be erased with one mushroom cloud that would appear one day. You never really know what's going on at the very top. But regardless, by and large, the U.S. has mostly been more aggressively imperialistic and right-wing since this time period. And so knowing that this is how it was, back in the early 1960s, that should really give us pause and make us think about these kind of institutions.
Yeah, especially for people who have seen Doctor Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick made this right in the middle of this. He couldn't have known that any of this was happening, but the Jack D. Ripper character is essentially, that's a good way to remember how that policy worked, because it's exactly that, and you'll never see a commie drink water. But yeah, so it's crazy that that's happening at the same time, because it's sort of the takeover of what C. Wright Mills calls the military cast of mind, or the military metaphysic. So how has that grown since the Cold War? Has there been, you talk in the book about sort of the incentives toward overprotection. So how have the Trumanite Network been able to scale up in the history since the 60s here?
Well, it's gotten worse by and large. I mean, there's a 2011 series in Washington Post, and I think they made a book on it called "Top Secret America" by Dana Priest and Arkin. I don't know the Arkin guy's first name, but anyway, it was they point out that there are 46 departments in the federal government working on classified national security matters with a budget of $1 trillion a year, and that these are not even, almost none of these people are political appointees, meaning that like people that are appointed by the incoming administration. Okay, that's only 247 out of 668,000 employees are political appointees. So this should be alarming to us, I think. And they're a bit different from the people running things back in the early Cold War, the best and the brightest that like Halberstam wrote about. These guys are more like Ivy League pedigree from elite families, and they're more often today made up of overachieving people who are really upwardly mobile, expert summarizers. They believe in American exceptionalism, but they don't want to seem like naive, or so they're rationalists about things. And above all, they want to seem tough, which was probably the case back then too. So yeah, it's a different group in some ways, but the overall dedication to the hegemonic project is still there. And there are incentives towards overprotection. You don't want to be responsible for any sort of failure. And Glennon, I think he plays this up sort of understandably, but at the same time, there's also, he says that you really don't want to be caught unprepared. But if we look at the times when the U.S. was unprepared, like 9/11, there was no penalty for bungling this. Even though, if you read like the Council on Foreign Relations official magazine, Philip Zelikow wrote an article before 9/11, a couple of years before 9/11, saying like about the effects of catastrophic terrorism, right? Where he more or less describes what would happen if there were a big terrorist attack and so on, which is more or less what happens with 9/11. So people saw this stuff coming, and even were theorizing about what it would mean, and they didn't really do anything about it. Instead, they just all get more budget, they get more money. The FBI is known for encouraging people to like stage plots, which they come in and foil at the last minute, so they get bigger budgets. You had the first World Trade Center bombing, where the guy recorded his FBI handler on the phone because he had some experience. And so it turned this informant that was working with the terrorists. And he even offered to the FBI saying, hey, I'll take the explosives out so that this bomb in the World Trade Center in 1993 doesn't kill anyone. The FBI said, no, don't do that. Right. So what was that all about? The bigger point is that like it may be even worse than what Glennon says, because yeah, they are overly paranoid in terms of wanting budgets to combat all of these supposed threats. But when they do bungle things, that helps them too, because if there's any sort of attack on the US, then what's the response? It's never for less money. So I think we have to, for these departments, we really have to take that into account too. So basically, it's kind of gotten worse, and it's a system that needs to have security threats to justify itself. And so, how is this going to impact the way that the U.S. relates to the rest of the world and to its adversaries? There's a lot of incentives to describe every adversary as 10 feet tall and posing a terrible threat to all of America and mom and apple pie and everything else. So these are the dynamics at play, and it's only gotten worse, I think, since the Cold War.
And Aaron, there's always in the background when we're learning this information, when you're reading your book, there's always this, historical context in the background that's pretty ironic of the so-called founding fathers talking about a system of checks and balances. Now, they largely wanted a system of checks and balances to hold checks and balances to prevent working people from having too much power and making sure that elite landowning interests would remain in control of the government. But there's also just the fact staring us in the face that we can see clearly with these unaccountable, unelected, institutions that this is not a democratic system. And what about the role of the so-called independent judiciary, which is part of this? Because in your book, you talk about Supreme Court justices like Scalia and Alito who have a long history of working with the U.S. national security state, working with intelligence agencies, and you quote Alexander Hamilton, who famously referred to the justice system as the least dangerous branch of the government. I mean, I think a lot of people today would, definitely take objection to that, seeing how we have these unelected theocrats who are appointed for life and can immediately take away rights from people in the United States just on a moment's notice. So clearly the Supreme Court has lost a lot of its legitimacy. But talk further about the myth of the idea of checks and balances. In fact, what we actually see is much less checks and balances, and instead we see we see quiet collaboration between the so-called independent judiciary that liberals profess their love for and the national security state that is completely unelected and unaccountable.
Right. I mean, the Constitution, there are a lot of gripes that you could have about the Constitution, and you summarized some of them pretty well, that it really was something that was geared towards not lowercase d democracy, but a system where property would be protected. And the better things about the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. I mean, this is where I think you can say that there were exceptional things about America and not be totally off base and ridiculous when you point out the Bill of Rights, which of course we violate in different times and so on. But those are probably the fundamental aspects of the Constitution that are worth honoring in terms of principles. The principle of free speech, free press, free association, freedom of religion, freedom from illegal search and seizure, and so on. But these other aspects of it are less so, but could potentially provide the safeguard against tyrannical governance, like the judiciary. But the way that it functions in practice is not as a safeguard for democracy. It ends up being safeguarding the power of top-down rule. And typically in our society, whenever you hear liberals or mainstream entities or commentators talking about an independent part of our regime, that is usually code for a bulwark for top-down power. So for the Supreme Court, the judiciary is like that. They're called independent, but they're the most establishment responsive part of the government. The Federal Reserve, the independent central bank, right? Independent, but are they really independent, or do they serve a particular constituency? Lately, the parliamentarian of the Senate is the newest, independent thing that we're supposed to accept has some legitimacy and is not to be questioned in terms of its arbitrary goodness. So this is like a way to have sort of top-down rule with this idea of independent institutions that are really just establishment-serving institutions. So the judiciary does not check the national security state except under very narrow circumstances. And a lot of the people who've served on the Supreme Court were involved in some of the shadier aspects of the national security state. Like Rehnquist served in the Office of Legal Counsel for Nixon and was involved in sort of okaying things like mass domestic surveillance of dissidents and so on. This is you have a guy on the Supreme Court who had been party to anti-constitutional law breaking, right? I mean, that's what the Nixon administration was involved in. That Rehnquist was a participant in that. Scalia was also in the Office of Legal Counsel. He would work with DCI William Colby, head of the CIA, during the Church Committee and Pike Committee hearings, working to decide which classified documents Congress should actually be allowed to get. For a time, Scalia was the person who approved all covert operations in conjunction with the executive branch. Justice Alito was part of the Army Signal Corps dealing with like top secret communications, and then later was part of the Office of Legal Counsel and applied his more or less the unitary executive theory, of Dick Cheney, where the president is essentially allowed to be the law personified. He was looking at legal questions from that angle, and then he gets on the Supreme Court. Justice Roberts was a clerk for Rehnquist, and he also served in the White House Office of General Counsel. He had to respond to a letter sent by Arthur Goldberg, who was a former Supreme Court justice, and Goldberg was complaining about Reagan's invasion of Grenada. And what Roberts said at the time was that the president has inherent authority in international affairs to use the military to defend U.S. interests. So meaning essentially that the president can act more or less as a dictator in terms of his use of the military anywhere he wants, because he's the one defending America's national interests. Okay, so, and there have been judges who had a more democratic view of the way society should be organized. Goldberg is a good case. Another case of where this Arthur Goldberg runs into the national security state is he had retired, but he was actually asked by people connected to the Democrats around the time of Jimmy Carter, if he would become the lead counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations to investigate the John Kennedy assassination. But Goldberg, he wasn't sure that this would be a good thing for him to do. So he calls the director of the CIA, Stansfield Turner, Jimmy Carter's director of the CIA, and he says, is the CIA going to cooperate with me in this investigation of JFK? And there's no answer on the line to this guy, former Supreme Court justice, right? And so he repeats the question. And then Stansfield Turner, head of the CIA, says, well, I thought my silence was the answer. So here we see a Supreme Court justice who is contemplating in a different role taking on the national security state. And he apparently had reason to suspect the CIA would not cooperate with an investigation into the assassination of a president. And he was correct about that. He said, my silence is the answer that you're going to get. So this shows you just, that they can be given all sorts of power if they're going to be validating the national security state and affirming its right to do whatever it wants. But when it comes to confronting it, then all of a sudden these guys are very weak. Granted, he was not on the Supreme Court anymore, but you get the point. It's like these guys have the ability to, the national security state can tell former Supreme Court justices how it's going to be, and they don't have much recourse. So it's a very weak part of the government. You're not going to get much help in confronting the empire from the Supreme Court unless a critical mass of the oligarchy decides it to be so. And my own sort of general sense is that the Supreme Court ultimately serves at the pleasure of the oligarchy and is responsive to political pressure that can't really be seen in the prevailing discourse in the newspapers and from politicians.
Right. It's very much a game of convenience with the judiciary because, in the Bush era, like you said, you see Cheney and the unitary executive stuff, but they rely on even just getting elected in 2000. They rely on the Supreme Court being the most powerful thing in the land, and everyone has to sort of bow down. And I think we're seeing the conservatives turn back to that now in the Biden era, obviously with Roe v. Wade being overturned. It's just a refrain back to whoever it's most convenient to have as the most powerful branch. And suddenly the courts matter again because they need it to, and it is able to create an illusion of Supreme Court having some pedigree left, which I think they've sort of wasted away pretty recently, even with the more, I guess, loyal liberals, as it were. But you talk in the book about how that illusion rests on 5 points. One being historical pedigree, like we've been talking about with the Constitution, and the education system really instills this respect for these institutions. Then you have ritual, things like inaugurations. You have intelligibility, which helps for sort of your civics nerds out there and your politics people, usually your more liberal-minded people. And then you have mystery, which I think partially includes the thing like when you talk about issues like these with sort of normie political voters and people who just know enough that they hear about something like, oh, this is something the CIA did, and they'll go, oh, well, it's they must have our best interests in mind. Oh, it's national security. Like they know more than we do. And so the mystery there sort of gives a cloak of secrecy that also makes them look maybe more important or like they have your best interests in mind, just out of your lack of foresight that they must have. And then the fifth one is harmony. And that's kind of the big one that we're talking about here with the judiciary is when you look at the way these judges, you hate to ascribe the power of who ascends to the highest court to the national security state alone, because it should be sort of just a class creation. But it's crazy how many of them have these very direct ties to the intelligence community. So, as we look at these public officials, as you write in the book, you say, quote, the public needs to be able to believe that if they would but elect the right people, the policies would change. But as Truman said at the time, these intelligence community people look upon elected officials as just temporary occupants of their offices. But supposedly, we tend to look to other checks on power. If you can't have the judiciary, then you're supposed to find those checks in Congress. So how's that working out for them?
Pretty badly. Congress is if Congress gets into double-digit approval ratings, the champagne corks start popping or something, right? Somewhere.
7% approval, incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, but let's not forget, over half of the members of Congress are millionaires.
Right. Well, they get good investment deals, from what I understand.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's no scrutiny there. But
no insider trading to see, nothing happening.
Yeah, I mean it's a club, of course, and all the incentives are there for Congress not to want to probe deeply into the national security state's business, and this is for a number of reasons. For one thing, the Congress people have to be generalists. They have to be somewhat conversant in foreign policy. They have to know economic issues, depending on what part of the country they're in. They have to be up on these cultural issues. They have to have the right positions on abortion and gun control and so on. And this can vary depending on where they are. And they really want to avoid disaster in terms of foreign policy related things. So they want to not be on the wrong side of something. Like you don't want to vote against a terrorism bill right before 9/11, for example. So there's incentives to make them just rubber stamp things for the national security state. For Glennon, he points out that there's less civic virtue. So this is where Glennon makes sort of vaguely conservative / liberal arguments about the problems with the American system being the fault of the American public to some degree. That the public is largely ignorant about foreign policy, and that since Congress people are only worried about re-election, they can't really go beyond what the public wants to do. But there's other factors as well. There's the fact that the Trumanites are the ones that write the bills. So national security people often, and their lobbying organizations often end up writing the legislation pertaining to national security issues. The Supreme Court has weakened Congress's ability to check national security policy. A 1983 decision invalidated the legislative veto, which dealt with like military plans and weapons sales, so that they couldn't dictate foreign policy to the president just by passing legislation. George H.W. Bush vetoed a bill that would have required the Senate's Intelligence Committee to approve covert operations. The presidents fought lots of wars without any congressional approval. Places like Grenada, Panama, Kosovo, Libya, Iraq, you can question whether Congress approved of that, but either way, the UN definitely didn't approve of that war, so it was illegal. The Syria covert operation, the dirty war in Syria, we've actually invaded Syria now and are occupying it. Donald Trump said we're stealing the oil, which is like, that's the part you're supposed to like not say out loud, but he actually said it, which is why Trump, as bad as he was in many other ways, was the least refreshing for occasionally telling the truth in ways you wouldn't expect. So there's all sorts of foreign policy initiatives that up to and including just knocking out foreign governments that Congress has no say over. If Bill Casey, the director of the CIA, said, the business of Congress is to stay out of my business. This is the guy who on the first day or the first few days of his tenure as director of the CIA, he sent a memo to a guy, I think his name was William Lewis French, who was the attorney general under Reagan. And this memo said, so you've got this rule that the CIA is supposed to tell you whenever any of our assets are trafficking in narcotics. We're not going to do that anymore. And that was just the extent of what it said. So this is a good example of how the law just can't check these people. Congress can't do it. Even the executive branch, I'm getting ahead of it, but even they don't have necessarily that much power. So there's a lot of examples of this, but I mean, Dianne Feinstein, whose husband is a national or military industrial complex millionaire, at some point she was getting spied on herself by the CIA when they thought she might be looking into torture and warrantless wiretapping, something along those lines. They start spying on her. So by and large, the Congress is made up of people who just aren't going to confront the intelligence community and specifically the national security state in general. One guy named Locke Johnson, an analyst, he tried to classify Congress in its attitude about intelligence. He said there's ostriches like Barry Goldwater. They don't want to know. They bury their head in the sand. They don't want to know. They figure it's not our business. There's cheerleaders like Dianne Feinstein who think that whatever the intelligence community is doing, it's good and it's for the national interest. There's skeptics like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the sort of liberal / neoconservative guy who, to his credit, after the Cold War said, maybe we should think about abolishing the CIA. I mean, we created this lawless entity in order to fight the evil communist conspiracy. But now that there's not this Soviet threat, do we really need it? Or what's it even for? Of course, he doesn't win that argument. And then there's the guardians of the Constitution of democracy, people like Frank Church. And they are very few and far between. I don't even think that you couldn't even really put Bernie Sanders in the same category as Frank Church today. So those people have pretty much vanished entirely from the American political scene. And when it comes down to it, the Congress is mostly interested in re-election. Confronting the intelligence community or the military-industrial complex is not a good way to get reelected, because you're not just messing with those entities, you're messing with all of the people whose meal ticket is connected to the activities of these agencies. So very powerful people. And there's no geographic constituency, no matter where you are as a congressperson. There's really no concentration of people who are very concerned with these sort of foreign policy or intelligence issues. So it's not a winning issue for you to base a campaign on. And there's no interest groups nationally, or if there are, they're very weak. Like Code Pink isn't going to be, AIPAC might have an influence, or Lockheed Martin or Goldman Sachs. These other interest groups that are on the imperial side can have some influence, but there's no huge interest groups with the power to influence electoral politics, which is all driven by money, because there's not huge amounts of money that are made by not being imperialist. Okay, quite the opposite. It's all the imperialism is where the money is at, imperialism and exploitation. And so the interest groups backing imperialism and capitalism have all the money in the world. And these other people saying maybe we shouldn't slaughter these people over in X country to steal Y resource or whatever. That's just not a perspective that's going to have a lot of power and money behind it, because that's more of a moral, humanitarian, human decency kind of a thing, and that's not really what prevails in this political system.
That's putting it mildly. Aaron, we've talked about the justice system. We talked about Congress, the legislative branch. There's, of course, another branch, the executive. And what's interesting to see is that over the years, as public trust in institutions like Congress and the justice system has completely declined, we've seen more and more eggs put into the basket of the presidency and more power vested in the presidency. We see, presidents making a lot of decisions via executive order, especially Trump. Although that's actually not necessarily new historically. You can go back to Eisenhower, who passed even more executive orders than any modern president. But the point is that we've seen a very strong concentration of power in the presidency. You talk in your book about the Obama administration, especially with the drone assassination program, NSA, mass surveillance. So how much power does the president have? Because even though we've seen that concentration, at the same time, we've also seen a very contradictory development that seems kind of like an oxymoron, where the power has been further concentrated in the presidency. People have lost all confidence in the justice system and the legislative branch. And yet at the same time, presidents still seem more and more weak. I mean, especially with someone like Biden, who's basically been a lame duck president ever since he entered. And I mean, that's even ignoring the fact that he clearly isn't making decisions because his mental health is very bad. So talk about the role of the presidency and the concept of the imperial presidency in this theorization of the state.
Right. So some critics of the national security state and American historians, people that are pretty knowledgeable, have made the argument that this is that we have an imperial presidency. And Arthur Schlesinger, who was a former OSS guy and then later worked under President Kennedy, he made this argument in the 70s, I believe, is when he writes this book. But he also, it's a strange thing, because Schlesinger himself was a guy who was who, when the Kennedy assassination happened, he suspected that national security people were involved, and but he didn't want to. He wanted to be part of the establishment, so he didn't really say much about it at the time. But he did say to people later on that, yeah, we were at war. The Kennedy administration, we were at war with the national security people. And his wife told the producer for Oliver Stone's JFK, this guy named Eric Hamburg, his wife said, "Oh yeah, Arthur's like agnostic, but I know it was like the CIA that killed Jack Kennedy," right? So this is an example of where the guy is like kind of contradicting himself, because he sees the U.S. Schlesinger saw the U.S. as an empire and the presidency as presiding over this war machine, even at the same time that he knew that that war machine had like overpowered his own boss, his own president and friend, President Kennedy. But because he wanted to be Mr. Establishment guy and he wanted to continue to play tennis with Richard Helms, he never really went there. But he would occasionally do something interesting, like he wrote a good review for John Newman's JFK in Vietnam, or he mentioned in his autobiography, Schlesinger mentioned in his biography of RFK that RFK never believed the Warren Commission about Oswald, and this was explosive because nobody really knew what RFK thought. They all assumed he supported the Warren Commission because he said that in his book. So why is he talking about this imperial presidency? Chalmers Johnson says this in a different way, but he doesn't really get into these other issues. But the point is, the presidency it does have control over the military and over the intelligence agencies and even over the FBI. But they increasingly have they respond to a higher power, it seems, because the presidents cannot really deviate from the course that is the preferred course of these, with the Trumanite network of the national security state, or what I would say the deep state, really, because you want to add in oligarchy, but that's the economic elites, but that's not really what Glenn and the double government idea is getting into. Just pointing out that the president's not very powerful when it comes down to it. The president nominally has all kinds of power to do things like launch the Iraq War and so on, but his power is really when he's working in concert with the national security state. If he goes against them, then he runs into all kinds of troubles. Recently, the Washington Post wrote, under the Trump presidency, they wrote that Trump was the first president since Richard Nixon to try to take on the CIA. And you probably remember when Chuck Schumer went on Meet the Press, and he said something to the effect of, "Oh, Mr. President, you shouldn't mess with the CIA. You mess with them, they got 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you," right? And it was like, that's very remarkable that this guy's saying it, because that's not what the Constitution says. He's more or less saying that, you better do what the CIA says. Obama famously has that quote. I don't know how famous it is, but it was a quote where he said, "What the CIA wants, the CIA gets." And people have speculated about his mom's relationship to the CIA and USAID and his Business International thing, which I'm not even going to try to unpack here. But the point is that Nixon's another one. Nixon fired the defense, or the director of Central Intelligence, and replaced him with a guy, Schlesinger, to try to get dirt on the CIA, because he thought the CIA was behind Watergate, because the Watergate burglars were all CIA retired, but they were really screwing him with the way that they had gotten arrested in such a stupid fashion. And then one of them, James McCord, was like basically wanting to make sure that the CIA wasn't blamed for the whole thing. And so Nixon tried to take on the CIA. He even went to Helms at one point and said, "Tell me about the JFK assassination. I want to know who shot Jack, so I can protect you and the dirty tricksters, but I want to know this." And he couldn't ever get those files. He never got these files, and he got kicked out of office before, or was forced to resign in part. And the military was spying on Nixon. They were spying on Kissinger, just trying to steal his papers whenever they could. Like they had this yeoman who was actually taking things from his burn bag and then giving them higher up the chain so that the military could spy on Kissinger. And Nixon was afraid to even do anything about it. He was like, "Oh, we don't want to make this into a bigger issue." So even when they break the law or withhold information from the president can't tell them what to do. And Nixon, when he ran into these forces and tried to confront them, it led to his resignation. It also led to massive exposure of criminality in the FBI and the CIA because of things that Nixon leaked, trying to expose and fight these entities that he perceived as being behind Watergate. That's the only reason we knew anything about what happened in the 70s, is because the president, Nixon, tried to actually take on the security services because he thought they were behind the scandals that were bringing him down. And they actually take a hit. The CIA goes to its lowest point after Watergate because of this, but the goal of getting rid of Nixon still happened, right? For example, and I'm not putting a halo on Nixon at all, quite the opposite. Kennedy, I think, was trying to do things that were more respectable, but even Nixon, with the way he wanted to have a successful presidency and wind down the Vietnam War and have détente with China, maybe even some arms control and some other issues that were too upsetting to the national security state and other important actors in the United States, he gets taken out. So this idea of an imperial presidency is not really true. The president is a subject of the empire and not so much its main protagonist.
So, Aaron, we've talked about the three different branches in the U.S.: judicial, legislative, executive. We talked about academic theorization of where power lies, how the structure of the U.S. state operates. How do people in academia, different scholars, explain U.S. foreign policy then? Because you've talked about many of the limits, you've talked about some of the different arguments. How do they explain the fact that U.S. foreign policy stays absolutely consistent regardless of who's president, when they deny the fact that these forces in the national security state are more powerful than the elected officials?
Yeah, they're not typically so candid about this, and there's more diversity than I can possibly among political scientists than I can really capture in the book. But by and large, you can say that there is a denial of the sort of top-down nature of U.S. foreign policy and of U.S. imperialism, and even discussing imperialism or U.S. hegemony is almost getting into it's almost too dicey, too radioactive. It's a rare thing for them to speak candidly about the U.S. as an empire that has to operate according to logics of all other empires, which is more or less the process by which economic elites of one nation, dominate another nation, right? That's a short answer for what imperialism is. This is not something political science gets into. It's considered almost gauche to talk about these things. But in terms of understanding foreign policy, and I'm not going to go into great detail here, mercifully, I think, for the audience, but there's two main approaches to the explanations about U.S. foreign policy. There's the rational actor model, which more or less posits that the American state should be looked at as a rational actor who makes choices based on a certain rationale. And there's different versions of this, whether there's perfect information for this rational actor to base its decisions upon or not. And the other one is the governmental politics model. And that one sees decisions as being based on bargaining games between certain interests and actors. And the problem with this is that there's really so many different variables that it's kind of impossible to say what variable or what actor is ever really responsible for any given decision. So this is why Glennon himself uses a slightly different one, the organizational behavior model, and he adapts that to the idea of a network instead of just an organization for a number of reasons. The result is that Glennon's idea of double government, which is kind of a version of the dual state, is better than conventional political science, even as it has some serious omissions.
I think Glennon's approach, from what you've said, is demonstrably better than a lot of the liberal mainstream, because it at least doesn't try to psychologize everything and looks to the way that maybe democracy, or it looks to the way that maybe we're not as much of a democracy as we'd like to believe, or that maybe certain people tell us. But at the same time, if you get into the minutia of what he's saying, he's looking at institutional structure, and then he's essentially blaming the inertia of our system on the way that that structure is set up. And so he's talking about the way that secrecy and compartmentalization, and just on a very basic level, institutional incentives moving up through an institution that you're a part of. Even C. Wright Mills talks about this, of essentially that the people at the top, the elites, the people running the show, are going to look to the younger people who match their mindset. And so there is every incentive on a personal level to match the current thinking and to not innovate and to not change too much. And as we've seen, that might not be the case, because at the time that C. Wright Mills was writing, there didn't need to be that much innovation. But Glennon isn't able to bring certain things in for that exact reason. And as you write in the book, most importantly, the omissions and oversights in Glennon's theory are central to the theory of the tripartite state theory. There are certain questions that he basically places outside the scope of his study, including what are the unchanging objectives of U.S. foreign policy. And so what he falls prey to, just like a lot of the mainstream, is trying to place our foreign policy institutions in a vacuum and not look at the ways that just saying there's inertia doesn't look at, well, where did we start out and why did we start out at that point? And why has there always been this sort of specific teleological bent to the way that the policies play out that isn't just some sort of stroke of luck that we just so happen to be on these rails and we just moved in that direction? Because as you point out, there are these more structural forces that are playing a role. So how does the field of foreign policy analysis, then, to kind of close us out today, how does that field come in here? And maybe how do certain people like your tripartite state theory and C. Wright Mills, how are you able to sort of remedy some of those problems of looking at it in a vacuum?
Well, foreign policy analysis is, as I understand it, a relatively new subdiscipline of political science. And they attempt to look at foreign policy. I think they were responding to a pretty obvious deficiency of the discipline as a whole in terms of dealing with foreign policy. And so they apply, with varying degrees of success and insight, they apply four approaches to U.S. foreign policy questions. One of them is like based on the individual decision maker, and that might be geared more around psychology. So I think, for example, the psychological biographies of like Woodrow Wilson, trying to explain why the League of Nations failure had something to do with the way his dad treated him. Okay, that's one psychological aspect of it. I don't think these are that useful. The psychology of elites, or especially when you're talking about American presidents, it's interesting to note that like the two presidents who were on the more progressive side were both like wealthy elites who kind of had some standing within the establishment, FDR and JFK, and that they were able to act sort of independently, and that most presidents typically are either part of the right as it was already, like the Bush family or Reagan, or they are people who can rise from obscurity and thus are obviously co-opted, because you wouldn't rise from obscurity if you weren't co-optable. So Truman, LBJ, Nixon, Clinton, Jimmy Carter, they fit this kind of mold of people who rise, whose psychology, to the extent that it's important, is important because they rose from humble backgrounds, which really meant that they had to be co-optable to people in power to rise. So that to me is about the extent to which psychology is really interesting in this kind of a context of big historical questions. The other approach is like group decision making. That sort of deals with like, social psychology in some ways, maybe. There's culture and identity is one way that people look at it. Most famously, Sam Huntington talking about Clash of Civilizations, really trying to put cultural a cultural spin on why foreign policy plays out the way that it does. This is useful for the establishment, and Huntington was an establishment guy first and foremost. And this kind of allows you to really ponder these differences that are supposedly so deep-seated between peoples and nations. So you might be able to say that China has this or that bent, or the Russians. I mean, we see this now play out in weird ways, with like Keith Olbermann talking about how he's ashamed of his Russian genes or something. I don't even know, but these are just kind of ways to obscure foreign policy. And then there's also and cultural issues, identity issues. The interesting sort of rejoinder to this is C. Wright Mills, who we're going to talk about in the next episode. But he wrote about the cultural apparatus, and he was more or less pointing out that he wanted to do a whole study on this, which the Ford Foundation wouldn't fund as a follow-up to the power elite. But he wanted to write about how the culture reproduces ideas or doesn't allow ideas to become powerful. And this is a function of the power in society. And so really the people that are producing academic output or cultural output, artistic output, they all have to have patrons. They all have to have people with money. They all have to be connected to established political institutions, because everybody has to eat, everybody has to pay rent, and so on. And so he really wanted to explore the way that this plays out in the United States, and how you have this kind of top-down domination of culture, not just, politics and the economy. But he was never able to do that. But I think that ultimately these things like culture and identity are heavily influenced by, like everything else, are influenced by money and power in society. Now, the other approach in foreign policy analysis is like a domestic politics approach, which does try to look at how domestic political actors influence foreign policy. And this is better, but in some ways, but they're still limited. And I think my summary here at the end was pretty accurate about it, in that FPA is an important subdiscipline with the worthy aim of illuminating the means and ends of the human decision makers who formulate and execute foreign policy. In this way, its practitioners are following C. Wright Mills' directive that a master task of intellectuals is to investigate the causes of war, and among them, to locate the decisions and defaults of elite circles. So these other approaches, they could produce useful scholarship, but unfortunately, I'll pick up again here, mainstream foreign policy analysis has a considerable aversion to materialism and elite theory. For this study, my book, therefore, mainstream foreign policy analysis scholarship is only as useful as the extent to which U.S. foreign policy is neither elitist nor driven by material considerations. But since U.S. foreign policy elites demonstrably achieve their elite status through organizations dominated by the overworld of private wealth, U.S. foreign policy is extremely elitist and driven by material considerations. And I of course stand by that. Still, I haven't changed my mind on that. I think that's about right.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect note to wrap up this part on. I mean, there's no question whatsoever in my mind, and I think anyone who considers himself a serious scholar cannot overlook the fact that U.S. foreign policy is created by wealthy corporate elites on behalf of wealthy corporate elites. Anyone who claims otherwise is either hopelessly naive or has drunk the Kool-Aid and is part of that very same system. Now, as you point out in your book, there are a few rare exceptions to these academics who refuse to see what's right in front of them. One of the most honorable exceptions is C. Wright Mills. And in the next part of this series, we're going to be talking about Chapter 4 of your book, which is about C. Wright Mills and the American power elite. I'm looking forward to that. I think it's going to be a great episode. But with that, I think we're just going to wrap up this part. It was a very good overview. In just an hour, I think we did a great job of doing an overview of theories of the state, the faults, the flaws and limitations of mainstream academic theorization of the state, and your corrective. And Aaron, I'll give you the final word to wrap up here.
Well, I think that my closing there about the elitist and materialist considerations of the foreign policy establishment is more or less what I would want to say. But I would just point out the questions that Glennon does not answer. And I would maybe end on some questions, which are, what are the unchanging objectives of U.S. foreign policy? When, how, and by whom were they formulated? How unchanging have they been? And what accounts for the variation that does exist? What are the big assumptions of the US political class? How did these assumptions arise? What social forces gave rise to the creation of the national security state? And how did these forces influence its development thereafter? I think that these are what we want to look at, and we want to, above all, look at power and keep our eye on power and who has power and who doesn't.
Very well said, Aaron. Very well said. Those are great questions to end on, and I think those are questions that we're going to be exploring and answering throughout the series, throughout the Empire and the Deep State series that you are listening to or watching. This is a joint production of American Exception and Multipolarista. If you want to support this show and get early access to all of these episodes, we still have a lot more coming in the series. You can go to patreon.com/American Exception, and you can also go to patreon.com/Multipolarista. You'll get early access to these episodes. I myself am looking forward to continuing this series. I'm Ben Norton. I'm joined by Aaron Good, the author of American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. And we're joined by the producer, Seamus McGuinness. Thanks, guys. That was another great episode.